So today I'm going to continue my commentary and reflection on chapter 26 of the Proverbs. Now, this is a part two. It's a part of a part, if you will. We are in chapter 26 of the Proverbs. And forgive me for a moment because I have to turn the page to find exactly where we are. So we are on a two-verse, extended verse, maybe I could say. Verse 24 and 25. Specifically verse 25. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Now, 24 and 25 together reads, He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. And so I have an extended reflection on the first part of that verse, and also of verse 25. But what ended up happening was that these 7 abominations, I had such a difficult time understanding, well, what about, how can I make sense of this word 7 in the verse with really very little contextual cues, that I had to draw a larger pattern. And that pattern was traced back to Genesis, of course, when we have the most obvious pattern available to us. So now, what we are doing is examining the pillars of the heart, that is, the identities of the heart, or I should say, the identity of the heart as a whole, but examining the pillars that make up that identity. And we are doing that through the lens of Genesis, through chapter 1, through each of the 7 days, because we have to find 7 abominations. Now, it's not to say that each day is an abomination, but when we flip it on its head, then it becomes an abomination. So in the last episode, I had gone through the first 3, and we're going to continue now, and hopefully by the end of this episode, finish with the 7, so we can move on in Proverbs chapter 26. So a lot has been said so far. There's been a lot of talk of intelligibility. There's been a lot of talk of the relationship between the material substrate of our reality and the purposeful substrate of our reality, how that formed, again, within the lens and view of Genesis, and how it has related itself to one another. There are a lot of fundamental concepts that occur in the first 3 days, that of light and darkness, the process of the morning and of the evening, the moving towards from darkness to light, and the moving from the light to the darkness, what that means conceptually, the firmament and what its role is, what it releases, what it brings together, the process of unification, the process of self-replication. And all of this we have formulated in the last episode into these pillars, by which we then flipped around and said, okay, well, here's the inverse. Here is how this can be a potential abomination. And like with many things, what we find is that the things that are the inverse, or the things that tend to lead towards absence, towards nothingness, towards absence and nothingness for the sake of nothingness. Now, there are many things to be said about the road to that place. But in general, I think that's a fairly concise summary of what many of the abominations lead to. And I should mention and I hesitate to mention because my mind is such a strange thing. It's always jumping from one thing to the other. And as I mention something, as I say that something is concise, it's probably a good summary of something, there's always in the back of my mind this voice that is saying, when you're in it, when you're thinking about this in detail, there's going to be a much more sophisticated and satisfying way to make a certain comparison or an analogy, generally an explanation. And so, although I say that, I don't want the mind to be committed to that being all that there is. The purpose of doing this is about the experience. It is about the unfolding of information. And that takes time. It takes time to get warmed up, and it takes time to establish those various relationships. But once that happens, I think then we come to a better place for which understanding and synthesis occurs. So, enough with the introduction, and I want to continue now with Genesis chapter 1 and our exploration into these abominations. So we just finished with the third day, and I'll read it now just as a refresher and then get into the fourth day. So starting with verse 9 and ending with verse 13, we have the third day rather. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself, upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. So this is where we are going to begin, because by the end of the fourth day, so we have verse 14 to verse 19. Verse 19 says, "And the evening and the morning were the fourth day." So I've discussed this before, but this is going to be the perfect place to begin. So we have the evening and the morning being the fourth day. So the natural question that comes in my mind, I have this notepad here, so it might take me a second or two to write and then to speak. But we have this evening, and we ask ourselves, well, what happens during the evening? We have that transition point where the sun is high in the sky to the place where it sets. We go from a state of light to a state of dark. Now, of light and of darkness, I think we can draw many different equivalencies, as we have done in many episodes. But just to name a few, of that which is light, we can think of, just for the moment at least, the physical manifestation, the physical perception of light. This can, I think, be a bit limiting if we restrict everything to the physical domain, because what we are talking about here is a larger concept that implies much beyond just physical vision. But if we take physical vision, because it is a fundamental aspect of our experience, we can ask the question, what does light afford us? And light affords us sight, but that really doesn't help us all that much. Sight is a form of perception. Now, perception is beginning to get to the root at hand here. Now, of perception, what is the definition of this term? If we follow the etymological chain of the word perception, we find ourselves in the Latin territory. The term perceptio, which means a receiving, a collecting, or an apprehension. Now, perceptio derives from percepere, meaning to seize, to take possession, or to observe. This Latin root is that combination of per, which means thoroughly, and capere, which means to take. And so we have this idea of thoroughly taking information. But of course, we don't just take information and then store it as that raw information. It's integrated into our experience. It is integrated into our behavior, our desires, our mode of action, the way in which we wish to behave in the world. We take in all of this information and we act accordingly to manipulate things in the environment. So this taking in of information is not just a static process. It involves a grasping and an understanding. Perception found itself in the English language in the late 14th century. And the meanings were understanding, awareness. Later usages related to the act of perceiving through the senses or mind. In the modern English and the modern tongue, it denotes a mental process of recognizing, interpreting, or becoming aware of sensory information. And this is what I meant by the physical sight. That we don't want to reduce everything to this, but it is a component of it. What we are after here is not just simple, raw information. What we are after is that information plus the agentic domain, plus what the agent does with that information. So back to this conversation about light. We can say that it is equivalent to perception, but we have to be careful to say that we have to be careful when we say perception, that it is not just restricted to the physical, sensory information. It involves taking in information, being aware of it, and understanding. I think understanding involves a degree of integration. So again, to reiterate, light, we think of sight, we think of perception, we think of awareness, we think of understanding, we think of sensory information. We think of processing, recognition. And of darkness, there's a degree of this that I think we can think about the opposite, that it is void of understanding. Or perhaps maybe there is understanding there, but there is a process that is underway, that is beneath the awareness. Like in our own experience, for example, there are plenty of things that picks up information from the environment that I don't directly control. There are organs within my body that I don't control. There are aspects, many aspects of my physical experience in this world that I have absolutely zero control over, not to mention all of the cells and even the bacteria that is in my gut that is working symbiotically. The agent that is speaking through this microphone is abstracted to a degree. Of course, it is part of this experience, no doubt. I don't wish to dissociate myself unnecessarily or delusionally, but there is a degree of separation between the two in terms of relatedness. I relate in terms of fundamental necessity, but I don't necessarily relate in terms of understanding the mind of a particular cell in my body, or controlling a particular cell in my body. So I want to add this aspect to darkness. That darkness, there are many things that I still have yet to say about it, but one thing is the procedural. But it's more than just procedural, because a procedure can find itself within the light just as much as it could find itself in the darkness. As far as my body is concerned, there are many procedures, there are many processes that are occurring, and perhaps I should say maybe a little bit more specifically about this procedure. Again, a quick etymological exploration here. If we go to the Latin, we have procedere, which means to go forward or advance, derived from the prefix pro, or forward, and sedere, to go or to yield. In medieval Latin, we have procedura, which refers to a method or a course of action. And just thinking about the body, thinking about various cells, of course they go forward, they advance in their own ways. They have their own methods of doing things and enacting their purposes. We could think of creation in the sense of maybe a DNA replication or of transcription. There is this process by which a particular sequence must be met, maybe to form a particular protein, or again a DNA that has to be of a certain structure to express a certain thing. So I'll say an addendum to that original statement that within the darkness is the procedural, because the light has its procedural as well, but it's a procedural process, this mechanism that is beneath awareness, that is unintelligible to a degree. Now, that we can be aware that it's occurring, but it is dark in many respects. That, at least in the way that I can conceptualize it, and the way that I've been using this example or illustration, the experience of the cells is not the experience of my being, my agentic self, the thing that is expressing into this microphone. And there's one further statement that I think is important here. When we go further back in, not necessarily time, but in terms of creation, we find that the waters are there in the beginning. They're with the light, they are with the darkness. And it's not as though darkness is void of everything. There are things that are happening in the darkness. But it's just beyond the scope of a particular mind, which may be a darkness to one mind, but aware to another mind. This can be quite complicated. But darkness, and I have to wonder about the fundamental sense of darkness relative to the Creator. How can darkness exist in the sense of this? It's a fascinating sort of thing. But darkness, in this way, again, I think can refer to something that is not completely void. Now, there's another way in which we can conceptualize darkness, which would be that complete absence or void. Now, it could be an absence of void of material or of information. But in the situation that we find ourselves here on the third day, as we enter into darkness, it wouldn't make much sense. Or on the fourth day, I should say. It wouldn't make much sense that the darkness that we now find ourselves in is completely void of information, because we have the material and we have the awareness. There's just this depression of information to a certain level or a certain state, and that is the state of darkness as we move from the day to the night in the evening. So I say evening to say that this is a process. And conversely, if we are to say moving from night to day, when we have this morning, there is another process that is occurring. It is moving from everything that we just said about the light and the darkness, the transition points between those two principles. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. So now here's an interesting development in Genesis and the creation of things. As we know, we are already exposed to the idea that light and darkness exist, that it has been created already. As fundamental principles, they exist. That of understanding and that of perhaps being, but beneath that of understanding, because darkness exists within an informational landscape, let's say. So information can exist within that darkness. And then we also have the conceptual aspect of darkness, that void, absence in general. But once we get to the firmament, we find that it has a particular task. It is separating the waters from the waters. The waters, there are many ways I think one can think about the waters, but I think about it in terms of information. And we have the meaningful, purposeful information, and then we have more of the raw, relatively meaningless information that follows a set standard, set of rules or laws. That the creative element in this standard material is given to it. It is not a self-replicating or self-generating creative enterprise or agent. And so the firmament in this sense is heaven. It is the vault of heaven that unleashes wisdom into the known reality or the created reality. And maybe I should say wisdom in the sense that it loves understanding, but also in the sense of the religio, that it brings things together, it binds, it tends towards that unity. And to the degree that it finds itself breaking things apart, it is to reorganize in a more holistic manner, perhaps. So God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night." So there are a few questions here. The first one is, well, surely there was light within the firmament before this point. Is there something about light that I don't understand? So let's think about the firmament again, for example. So as I've been conceptualizing it, the firmament is this expanse that separates the waters from above from the waters below. The waters above are, again, the creative element, the minded element, the purposeful element. In here, we don't really, just in the basic conceptualization, we aren't really thinking about it in terms of light and dark. I suppose there are some parallels that we can draw, but here we are primarily just thinking about information. Now in the firmament, in the eye of the firmament, it would be difficult to imagine that once the firmament is created, it is created without light within it. Now we know that light exists independently of the firmament, but it's not until the fourth day that we are explicitly exposed to the idea of light being in the firmament of the heaven. But also, as I've just noticed here, we're talking about the firmament of heaven. And here I have to go back to our etymological discussion about the word firmament. We've had this in the last episode, but I might have to do some correcting of some things here. So in terms of firmament, we can look at the Latin, we can look at the Greek, and we look at the Hebrew. From the Latin, we have firmamentum, derived from firmus, meaning firm or strong, suggests something that is solid, something that is stable. And this was adopted from the Latin vulgate to signify the sky or a vault of heaven as something firm or fixed. Before the Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, translated from the Hebrew rakia as stereoma, again meaning something that is solid or firm structure. From the Hebrew rakia, again it implies an expanse, something that is stretched or spread out, interpreted or seen as the sky or the dome of heavens. So I'll have to take a few steps back here. So if we are to imagine something that is firm, something that is solid, and yet it is an expanse, it is something that covers something. That dome is not in and of itself the heavens. It is something that covers something else, something that gives a boundary or perhaps even an identity to something. And so the firmament, perhaps we can think about it like the pupil of the eye. The pupil it is not the dark aspect of the eye. It is but the hole that we gaze through, and that what we see, that blackness, is the back of the eye. We can imagine the firmament in this way, kind of, except in this situation, maybe we'd be talking about the rim of the iris. And it is not necessarily that thing, that rim, the dome, that is actually giving us the purposeful element. It is the thing that is necessary for some process to occur, perhaps. And if we are to think about the firmament like an eye, that there is something behind the eye that is the primary engine that takes in information, but also in this situation it expels information. It brings things together. And so now I think what we are thinking about is not necessarily the superficial identity of that thing, which in the superficial sense it would be called the firmament. But as we dive within that thing, we find something more sophisticated. We find the heaven. But now that we find ourselves here, another question arises. Well, now that we are in the heaven, whatever that is supposed to mean, why is there not light here? It would seem that in the heaven, that's where light originates. That is where the meaningful and purposeful element of all creation finds itself for our minds to grab onto. But then when we go to the word heaven, we find an interesting parallel between that and the firmament, that it is an expanse. It is referred to as the sky, the firmament, the home of God. To cover, to conceal. The dwelling place of the supernatural. Supernatural is not the right word to use here. The dwelling place of transcendent beings. Maybe supernatural would be there. Transcendent beings. I have to be careful with my language. A certain type of information that is unified and organized, that is different from what we would find ourselves aware of immediately at least, in our own experience. Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven. So what we could be imagining here is that there is this abode, there is this place for which purposeful agency exists, whatever form that may take. And the formal discussion is not a part of this conversation. It is too much at this point. But we seem to have this sort of telescoping view of reality. We have the firmament, but then within it we have a heaven, which can be seen as another firmament. And so I have to wonder exactly where this image is prompting us to. What place, what image we ought to design. It could be saying that the heaven is a creative agent in and of itself. That much like the plant in the verse before, perhaps the original firmament that was to be and that separated the waters from the waters, indeed included this light. It expanded out and connected information. But now within that thing, there is a seed of heaven. That is a light that's now dividing the day from the night, which we know has already happened. And so there is this process that is occurring seemingly within the process that occurred before. Again, much like verse 11 and 12. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." Now, instead of this process creating or organizing the waters above and the waters below, what we have is something that's more specific. It is the organization of something into regular patterns. Of a sign, we think of a symbol that conveys some message, a package of information, if we will, like a meme. It extends beyond physical marks. It has abstract representations. So today is a new day. And so, like always, it will take some time to warm my mind back up and to get back up to speed. I want to focus on this idea of layering, of fractals, maybe we can say. Of a particular image that would illustrate this would be the Russian doll. Small in character, but increasingly grows in size. Similar features again throughout. And each level of this doll, I think, can be an analogy or a parallel to something that we find in our lives, something fundamental that we see about the universe, about our relationships. And surely the philosophical and religious road that we have been traveling so far, not just in Genesis but also in the Proverbs, it's undeniable what many verses are pointing towards. Part of it is an interwoven nature. Part of it is this layering like a cake. And in each layer, there is a certain familiarity. Well, it may be expressed differently it still retains elements, principled elements, from the layer before, from something that is more fundamental. And in terms of Genesis, we start quite fundamental in the beginning, and we slowly build out into something that gives us life. But all the while, the process of creation, that Genesis, is occurring. It really doesn't stop. I think there is something further to be discussed about the separation between day and night. My apologies if I've already mentioned this before. I can't really remember, but there's something deep in my mind, despite my poor memory, that is telling me that there's something about this day and night that remains unexplored. As I look at my notes, my little illustrations as I have been talking, I'm again reminded of the first firmament, in which water sub A and water sub B are separated. And in this way, I find myself thinking about information. There are two types of information. There is the waters above, which is the more purposeful information, meaningful information, conceptual, formal. And then the waters below, the material, raw. Again, I mentioned before about the quality of night, that it can be procedural to a degree, procedural that is beneath awareness, but also understood. Maybe the exact mechanism isn't understood, but the mechanism continues nonetheless. It is like the natural law. But then I find my eyes drifting over to this illustration about the separation between night and day, and this flux between the two, the moving into one out of the other, and again moving into that one from the other. And unlike this purpose and material, the water sub A and the water sub B, that I can easily say broadly that this is information, I find it more difficult to find a term that really represents day and night, despite all of the things that we have discussed. What I'm moving towards is an idea that perhaps this day and night situation is a particular viewpoint that requires an agent. Now, what does that mean? A particular view that requires an agent. All of this day and night, we have the idea that light brings us, and maybe I need to get away from this light, but at least for now, that what the day brings us is intelligibility, it is understanding, it is perception for a purpose. And night, again, is almost akin to the material in that informational sense. That there is some process that is occurring under the hood, so to speak, that makes the car run, but it is the agent's action that drives the car. The car is subject to the agent, but the car also affords the agent a tool in order to advance his purposes. Now, this analogy I think is quite limited, and I don't think it encompasses the whole of what I wish to accomplish here. Another thing that has just occurred to me is that there is an equivalency between light and day and darkness, night, for this is what God has called these terms. So let's return to this agentic idea, the idea of the subject in terms of night and day. Now, light can be seen as the prime actor, I think, in this situation. And if light is to be equivalent to day, we can say that day is a prime actor in this situation. It is the thing that decides, it is the thing that purposefully moves forward. It is separating itself from that of the night. And again, I want to continue with this line of the night being a mechanistic, naturalized mechanism, perhaps on top of which the light exists, that understanding exists. It's hard to say exactly what that relationship is, but I think that that is moving in the right direction. So in terms of a term, like again, this separation of the waters, purpose and material of information, just generally speaking, I don't think we can just say subject in terms of day and night. I think we can say agent, but I think that there also needs to be another term here. I think perhaps in part what we are thinking about, what we're being prompted to consider, is a positional development. And that is that the agent although he may behave, that he may execute purposes, he is nevertheless bound to night in some fundamental way. He's separated, but related. And I think that this relationship or this binding is going to come in time. And there's another interesting bit about this verse that I think is worth mentioning here. So I'll read it again. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them." Now that's interesting that we have a reference, and it's a plural, and the question arises, well, what is this referring to? And really the only other thing that is there that is plural is lights. And so the second part of this verse, "and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years," this is referring to the action of the lights. Okay, so what does this mean? The lights are for signs, which we've already mentioned. This rich symbolic landscape that is there for the mind to see and to understand. For seasons, what is a season? We could say that it is a change from one state to another. We could say, just generally speaking, that it is a pattern. It is something that is easily identifiable by the changes that occur. There are things that we can easily point to. Now, it happens to be the end of October in the Midwest of the United States. And the thing is, aside from the strange weather that we're having, it happened to be 80 degrees today, and in this location, that is quite strange, the Chicagoland area, for late October. It'll probably come down a bit, certainly as we go into November, but it's quite unseasonal. But typically speaking, around this time, we're finding ourselves in cooler and cooler temperature. Surely, the change to the environment is evident. There are leaves that have changed colors. They are rapidly falling off of the trees, and we are about to enter into this new space. We're in a transitional space now. We will find ourselves in winter shortly, for which it'll be quite cool. There will be no leaves on the trees. The grass will be brown, and that will be our experience for a number of months until we go into spring and that transitionary period into the summer. So if we take all of that I just said, we package it up and ask ourselves, well, what just happened? What was that explanation? And I think that was the light. That was understanding the seasons. Now, there are various ways in which one can abstract and further understand what's happening There are plenty of causes that we can think of and identify, and it could get quite sophisticated fairly quickly. I gave a broad overview of what we experience here in this location in terms of the change in seasons. But in the most basic sense, what is important here is the pattern, the recognition of that pattern. And the same can be said for the days, and the same can be said for the years. There's something regular that is identifiable. The regularity can be found at night, surely, as I've mentioned, a sort of unconscious procedural undercurrent that is just sort of humming along, information that has yet to be realized. But yet it is there to be seen and understood. For we may have some conception of a day, we may have some conception of a year. The time, I don't want to say maybe arbitrary, but in terms of our understanding of what a year is, and our understanding in general, I think we can come to a conclusion about something and not really understand the full image, the full map of what we are actually considering. And in a broad sense, we can identify a pattern or an interval in the world that is true. It may develop over time into something that is more maybe accurate or better understood. So verse 14 is in conjunction with verse 15, which reads, "And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven, to give light upon the earth. And it was so." So today is a new day, and it is in the evening after work. Always a particular feeling that comes from the evening. Sort of a bittersweet ending to the day, and the desire for a productive hour to finish off the day. And often I find in these moments, at this time, at the end of the day, when I wish to be productive once more, in terms of the reading and the interpretation, I find that if I have a good one, something that's self-reflective, something that's meaningful, the day after tends to be simple. I tend not to be burdened as much. And so the initial thought as I start the recording again is for a good session to date, this evening. So I want to start by rereading verse 14 and then again reading verse 15. "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so." Quite a fascinating follow-up verse, or follow-up second half, we can say. On one hand, it seems like a pattern that we see often in the Bible, especially in the Proverbs. This reiteration for emphasis, but also a slight difference. It seems to me, on the first pass, to be a reiteration, a confirmation of a pattern that we have identified before. And this is the pattern of the fractal structure of Genesis and of the approach to understanding reality. And that is to say, at least in the beginning few words here, and let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven. It is an echo of the first part of that verse, of course. Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven. And then it is taking the second half of the first verse, and let them be for this, that, and the other. In the first instance, what we were talking about, the let them, was the reference to the lights. And so we have to ask ourselves the question now, and let them be for lights. Again, what is the them? Because originally it was lights. Now my inclination is to say that the second verse, in the first couple words, and let them, I believe that it's also referring to lights. But the interesting part of this is that it says, and let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven. Let the lights be lights in the firmament of heaven, to give light upon the earth. And so here, I think what is unfolding is that fractal structure. For we have to dive into what it would mean to have a light within the firmament, and then to have a light within that light, I guess we could say. Or at least the purpose of the light that is to give rise to another light. That then that sequential, the propagation of those lights, or of the days, now shines upon the earth. And that's another conversation, I think. But first, I want to really drive home exactly what this structure is that we are seeing. So there's quite a large conundrum that I think really needs to be hammered out here in terms of my thinking about this. And the conundrum is as follows. As I'm looking at chapter 1 of Genesis in a sequential manner, I see that light has come to be, and we've explored conceptually what that means, and I think that I have a grasp of this term. And the same goes for darkness. The thing that my mind finds interesting is that when we encounter the establishment of the firmament, it is within an environment for which light and darkness already permeate the landscape. And so the question then becomes in my mind, well, what about the inside and the outside of this thing that we call the firmament? Is it to be something, I think that I've almost intuitively conceptualized as almost like a portal that emits something, that has a degree of agency? But as we've discussed before, in the etymological sense, the firmament was seen as an expanse, like the sky. It covers something. But much like light and darkness, in their equivalencies, day and night, firmament and heaven seem to go hand in hand. And heaven, certainly from my perspective, is something that is much broader than just like an umbrella that would cover somebody from the rain. But in this domain, I must hammer out something a little bit more sophisticated in order to move on, because clearly there is something that I do not have quite right here. Now going back to verse 6, and God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide waters from the waters." And in verse 8, God called the firmament heaven. So I think it might be useful just to examine this term heaven as the merits of what we associate the firmament with, given what we've been exposed to thus far. I think this is where I may make a departure slightly from some of the earlier rhetoric. Let's take two schematics. This is something that I've talked about probably yesterday, but it's useful, I think, to go over again. We have day and night. Day is equivalent to light. Night is equivalent to darkness. In this sense, again, we are imagining more of an agentic view, a subjective view of things. There's an agent that is experiencing. The separation between day and night is necessarily the light, or what we might expand to be something called goodness. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. So this goodness separates understanding from that of the mechanistic underpinning of things. On the flip side, maybe not on the flip side, but in other terms, we have that of purpose and we have that of material. Light and darkness seem to be more fundamental concepts upon which we have that purpose and material, for there must be light for purpose to exist, and there must be darkness or night for material to exist. And we have to get away, I think, from the purely physical representation of these terms. The physical representation should have a place in our mind, but it is certainly not primary. That material analogizing is there only for the springboard of our subjective experience, so that we can jump onto this plane of thinking that is metaphysical. So my apologies, but this is going to be all over the place. It will come together in time. But I had a thought, just going over the first few verses again in the chapter 1 of Genesis. Of the creation of heaven and earth, of the earth being without form, void, darkness being on the face of the deep, the face of God moving across the waters. There seems to be this idea of an idea. There's a conceptualization of experience, a conceptualization of existence, but the concepts don't have grounding, they don't have organization in the way that they do after light and darkness is separated, in the way that they do after day is conceptualized and night is conceptualized, in the way that once the firmament further separates information into two categories, there are a few themes that we are trying to follow simultaneously. One of which is, as I've mentioned, this coalescing of information into something that, at least downstream, the agent that is produced by it can recognize. We're trying to identify the patterns that we see that are scaled up or scaled down to the macro or to the micro within the concept of the evening and the morning, the transition point between that light and dark. And of this illustration about day and night and purpose and material, about the firmament being that thing, whatever it might be, separating purpose from material, separating meaning from material. We understand that God said that there was something that was good about the separation between day and night. Perhaps it can be said that there's something good about the separation of purpose and material. That it is a good thing to understand material for its own merits. But understanding material for the sake of material will not get us purpose. Purpose is a separate affair, its own domain. But of this purpose, I think a man can find himself wanting of it, but also ignorant of it, and still have it. The bizarre catch-22 of our experience of our condition. I think we've all experienced those people that live their lives in relative peace, and yet they don't seem to have to try all that hard. And there are others of us that seem to be burdened by the very thought of existence itself. It requires considerable effort. It requires considerable effort to try and understand, as if understanding was an impedance to that peace of mind. And so all of this can become quite confusing fairly quickly. But I believe that since we are talking about this firmament and its progression, that we are adding these lights to it, it is bringing in an earlier concept, a fundamental concept, and inserting it into what seems to be another fundamental concept. I want to reiterate again the firmament that separates purpose from material. The firmament is equivalent to heaven, so we could say that the heaven separates purpose and material. This separation, I think I initially thought, would be split evenly if given lights. That would be, the day would either find itself at the material side or on the purposeful side, and the night would be on the material side or it would be on the purposeful side. But as I think about it now, it doesn't make much sense to associate purpose purely with day and night purely with material. There may be some parallels and some consistencies that can be drawn there, but it is not fully sensible. And it is, as I've mentioned, in the case of purpose, I think it is possible that a person can find themselves in the light with regard to purpose, but also in the dark with regard to purpose. And so, when the light is given to the firmament, it is given to permeate purpose and also material, so that material will find itself in the light, but also may find itself in the dark. And so we have this sort of transpositioning, this covering of an agentic or a subjective view of things that is seemingly impossible to separate. It is by virtue of the agent being that there is this separation between day and night. And I want to say that the reason I think that that is true is because regardless of I can only, I suppose, speak from my own experience, but I have to wonder about the first cause. And if the first cause did not admit the night or admit darkness because of the desire to wish to know and to understand. But anyway, we'll put that on the shelf. It really doesn't have any functional purpose for us now. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven, to give light upon the earth. And it was so. I have trouble separating myself in it, for good reason that this verse is a two-parter. There are two verses in this segment of information. It's so hard to get away from that first verse. What is verse 14? And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years." So I want to think about what is next here. We have this image of the firmament that is separating the waters from the waters above, which is the minded waters, the purposeful, the meaningful. And then we have the material, more of the strict observance, the non-agents, the information that provides the agents with a substrate for their existence, but also for their purposes, a natural support. As this is divided by the firmament, we introduce lights into the heavens, and we find that now every agent that is exposed to purpose and material will both observe the luxury of that purpose and material, but also they will be tempted by all of it, to understand all of it, and to expose all of it to the light, and none of it to a creator that has perhaps an understanding, an experience far beyond the agent that interprets. I say this because I think of the further separation again of purpose and of material into day and night, into light and dark. And on one hand, I glorify. I can't help but be thankful that the light has been introduced into purpose, and that it has been introduced into the material. But also, I wonder why that darkness is also there. If, for example, all we saw, all that was the firmament without the introduction of the lights, what then would be the situation? I would have to imagine that it would be unintelligible to a being like myself. And I think to myself that it is the action of God that had separated the day from the night to begin with. And I come back to this idea that I've discussed before about what it means to have the day and night together. To have understanding and absence exist together. They would seem as a bit of a negation, that it would actually be nothing. or at the very least, their cohabitation would be unstable. And because of that instability, there would have to be that separation, that the light would have to be something in and of itself, and the darkness would have to sort of be something in and of itself, in the sense that light permeates it. And so in this way, again, I don't necessarily see the darkness or night as a bad thing, although there are plenty of negative things that can be associated with it, like chaos and evil, that of inattentiveness. A deep darkness is often associated with the mind that falls into a pit. It is that the Sheol, the pit of Sheol, that the psalmists speak of, the place for both the living and the dead. The living find themselves there when the mind has been corrupted by that darkness, for which the attention cannot orient itself appropriately. Now, I think what is happening here in verse 14 and verse 15 is that we have, on one hand, the purposeful component that is being separated, that is being drawn through by this introduction of the light, that is separating the components that would otherwise corrupt understanding, corrupt sight, and bring it into view. That which necessarily must be dark or obscured to the agent may continue to be so as its relevance to that agent decreases. It is not the situation that at any given time the agent will see everything all at once. Things will inevitably fall into darkness. And then in the second verse, that of verse 15, we are talking about the running through of material, the separation or the introduction of light, the separation of day and night into the material domain, and that is the giving of light upon the earth. And God made two great lights, a greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So here's an interesting concept, that there are governing lights, and there's a light that governs the darkness, which I find fascinating. That even among this space that has a lot of negativity associated with it, but also the natural processing of things that doesn't necessarily require an agent for it to be, even this is governed by a degree of agency. Not to the point where the darkness is consumed by the light, but rather to the point where the chaos is put at bay, such that the order remains stable. In what way can we see a light being greater than another? For surely we can imagine that one light is the same as another, in the sense that it facilitates the same things. But of physical light, we can imagine an object of a particular luminosity and another object of a particular luminosity. Now, my reading lamp that is over the Bible only covers so much ground, so much distance. It only affords so much luminosity. However, if I were to turn on the lamp in the corner of my room, the luminosity from the bulb would be significantly brighter than that of my reading lamp. It would cover greater distance. I would be able to see more. And in the metaphorical landscape, seeing more means understanding more. And so I suppose it makes sense to say that that greater light, that lamp in the corner of my room, is to govern the principle of light, for that is the one that shines brightest, whereas the one that shines least is the one that provides stability to absence. For the negative components of that absence to threaten what we would consider our ordered world, would be put and set at bay when it contacts this lesser light. Now the expression he made the stars also, it seems a bit secondhand, like it's thrown in there, but surely there is some significance. Now the star, of course, is something that emits light, but it is also something that is seen physically. And so I have to wonder here if, although this may seem like it is secondary, pushed aside, perhaps it is in a way. Perhaps it's to suggest that as much as we describe the mechanism of the light within the sphere that means something, there is also that mechanism of light materially. That is something that we actually interact with. It's something that we can measure. For procedurally, when we think about the day and we think about the night, these are conceptual things. These are minded concepts that originate before the organization by that firmament. And there's a few different thoughts that I suppose would work here. I think one is that we are thinking about a mechanism that is creative, that is generative, that is agentic. So there is this aspect of seeing before there is actually thingness, or at least thingness in the sense of the agent that is below that is thinking about it. It's difficult to understand exactly what it would mean for the first agent to be thinking into nothing. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But just generally being an agent that is the first agent of purposeful thought or of purposeful action. But as we will see, the stars have yet to encompass a broader meaning. We still cannot boil this down to purely material that is non-purposeful. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. So once again, it would seem, at least in my mind, that I'm thrown for this new adventure. That I have to now figure out where we are in terms of the firmament. What it means to have this massive divine hand that places these symbols of stars into the firmament. And it seems like it's at once occupying this space outside of this lens that is interpreting things. It is entering through this expanse, through the sky. Now, not sky physically, but through the expanse of intelligibility, of known intelligibility. What is being placed into it is a symbol that is more than just that which burns in the sky when we look up at night. But in fact, in the spiritual sense, I think I would say that what is happening is that of the categories that we've been playing with before, where in the original sense the firmament is the thing that separates purpose from material, or rather it gives form to purpose and material, but also gives this dividing line. And then we find ourselves in the domain of dividing purpose and then dividing material. And that is to give light to each of those, but also to give darkness to each of those. And by extension, what we are saying is that we are giving day and night to purpose, we are giving day and night to material. That also includes the implication of the morning, the evening and the morning, that of the transitionary periods between both of them. And the implications of that for the human mind I find staggering. And I say that because we're in one now, and I really have to wonder what the historians will think 1,000 years from now, exactly what had occurred here. And I hope that our voices manage to echo into the future to explain to them how we felt and what was happening. But I can't imagine that this is anything new. That a mind that finds themselves within this type of situation, establishment, and perhaps I should explain further what I mean. I'm of the opinion that the mind in the sense of the free world is going through a transitionary phase. It seems like it is moving into, or has moved into, it has seen the evening of the material, and it has seen the evening of purpose. And so we enter into night for both, for which the human mind isn't necessarily the guiding force of his collective will, that it is up to any old whim of his. And even that's difficult to think about, because if he is up to any old whim of his, he doesn't quite understand who he is, because he is so easily captured by things that are inferior, that are not unified, or at least in him are not unified, where he may have a desire towards some exploit. He takes it, and he puts his attention towards that thing. And because the attention is paid, what he receives in return is the product of that payment. And if that product is not something that is productive, we could say that not productive materially, but also, and I think more importantly, purposefully productive, spiritually productive, that expands the man's understanding of himself, of his place in the physical world, but also in the spiritual domain, then he will find himself much reduced to a period or to a situation that he had devoted such cognitive resources. But what we are thinking about here shouldn't necessarily be restricted to the thought of how the mind is changing from more of a meta perspective, an objective perspective. I think we're in a beautiful situation here because we are coming through a particular door, and we always have to remember where we are, that this interpretation is easily getting lost in Genesis, but we are actually in the Proverbs. And we are thinking about the heart of man. Ultimately, we are thinking about how the heart of man can fall into this abomination of the days of creation, the inverse of what we're reading currently. But it is only going to be beneficial if we go through the exercise of understanding what the pillars of each day actually mean for our own constitution. More specifically, if we think about the heart as an aspect of mind, perhaps we think about, I say this other aspect broadly and generally, but that directing force, the rational force of us that is on the other side of mind, this is not really what I'm talking about. But of course, the rational mind is used to understand itself. So there's this marriage in the mind. The mind is ultimately a unity, so we have to take the separation of the two major components in stride. But nonetheless, as we consider about the heart, as I think about myself, I think about those for whom I care and I love. When I think about the heart, I think about something quite fundamental to who they are, to who I am. I think about that thing that anchors us emotionally to experience, not just reasonably to it. And I think about all of the ways in which that thing can be driven to error, that can cause us to wish to believe things, even tempt our reason to believe things that are not true. But it can just as easily find itself producing an inclination, an intuition for our reason, such that it guides it in remarkable ways, in ways that are almost supernatural, since it is driven by something that is not explicitly rational. So I hope I can be forgiven, but today is a new day. And I wish to try and keep this somewhat continuous, so I'll do my best to continue on that last thought, or at least the sentiment. And from what I remember, I was speaking of the heart. I was trying to reorient the mind to remember that we are actually in the Proverbs, and thinking about the structure of the heart, the identity of the heart at a principled level, through the eyes, through the lens of creation, through Genesis. These two great lights have been given to the firmament. These great lights, it seems like it is a tool of recognition, a tool of understanding, that the lesser light is responsible for the material. It gives it this aspect of intelligibility, although it may not be of the same type of information as that of the minded sphere. That great light, which is the governor, or the illuminator, the intelligizer, if that makes sense, of all that is minded information, purposeful information. And in my mind, since we are talking about, in the broad sense, these fractal structures and fractal relationships, it would seem that this is an extension of that. We're at a new level, a new layer in that Russian doll, so to speak. And that what we have here is a continuation of the gathering of the waters, a further intelligizing of the waters. As we bring the waters below together, we find the earth and the material as we understand it to be. But as I think about this illustration of the lesser light that is coming over the earth, in some sense I think about the heart and this lesser light that comes in. It gives purpose to the periods for which we are pacified. It's not a good word to describe it. For the periods that we are at rest, as one potential. Periods that we are in the flow, perhaps. That much is given to this natural processing, that it is not really influenced heavily by that top-down action, that it wishes to manipulate and to drive. I think about the greater light that comes down. It gives light upon the earth. Of course, this is a stretch to fit in the Proverbs here. There's more, I think, to be said about this, the nature of the verse that we are discussing. But nonetheless, this greater light that is over the heart, I think about that purposeful action. I think about strong emotion, directed emotion, willful desire. But all of that, of course, moving in a particular direction, just as the waters have come together, and just as we see now in this, as we moved into this new structure, similar in pattern as the structure before, but more finite, or more compact, maybe we would say, in the physical sense, surely more compact also in terms of the information. Now, in the sense that we're talking about a great light and a lesser light, one that governs the day and one that governs the night, I think it's fascinating that both are here on the material domain, the material substrate. And this is something that appears to me to be a strong relationship between that of the purposeful, directed, perhaps we could say conscious information, or consciously involved information, and that of the relatively purposeless, ordered to a degree, but not organized by something in particular, not ordered by a purpose. If the two are together, there is this, that is the greater light and the lesser light, there seems to be this confluence, like that relationship between energy and mass, E equals mc squared. While, from my perspective, I don't necessarily see immediately and dramatically mass being converted into energy. But of course it is happening. It is happening at all different types of levels, some of which I cannot perceive nor understand. But in the sense that we are speaking of here, I say this to be a precursor to life, because we have this greater light that is the governor, that is the illuminator, that gives understanding to purposeful information, that this is also, that this is atop of a particular substrate of matter. That means it has the authority to influence matter in such a way to produce potentially agents. Now, of course, we understand that life already exists on the earth. And of course, we also understand that this process has occurred before. The process that has occurred before was enough to give light on the earth, or to give life on the earth. The process that occurs now is, I think, a next step. It is the step that moves life and material into a higher register of consciousness and of purposeful action. So again, and God set them forth in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. A verse that we have seen, obviously. It's a reiteration. Again, a step in another direction. Another division. Another separation from a particular type of darkness into a particular type of understanding, awareness, perhaps. So let's stop here for a moment, since we have just finished the fourth day, for we have to discuss the heart again, and also eventually get to the inverse, the abomination. So what I see here, if we think about the waters in the context of our desires or our emotions, Or rather, I should say, if we should think about our desires and emotions, we should think about them in terms of the waters, that they can be, perhaps in a primitive state, like in an animal or in a developing child. These emotions are volatile, quite variable. They're not as affixed as they ought to be, at least to form some stable agent that can act in the world, that can survive independently. I think the same could be said of the mature person as well, in the broader sense of how that mature person, and the mind of that person is integrated into his society. If we zoom out even farther, I think we can think about how that mind has developed over thousands and thousands of years, how the mind had come to be from more primitive forms of his lineage. We could think about, this is going a little bit farther than I would like to, but the point at which we find that marked difference between that animal and the human being. And we could think about the interesting divine process, perhaps miracle, that occurred there. But to return to the heart, if we imagine these waters that are coming together, that are forming something that is more coherent, it is certainly purposeful. Perhaps we don't know exactly what it's for. Perhaps there's an event in our life. There's something that we know is coming. We know perhaps quite explicitly what it is, but there's a lot of uncertainty associated with it. The heart is just this engine that is running, that's turning, perhaps producing painful feelings of uncertainty. All of this unhoused or unrealized potential and information, it is gathered by the firmament. It is gathered by heaven. It is gathered by the very thing that allows understanding to permeate a mind that is separate from the original cause. As the emotions of the body and the emotions of the mind come together, the emotions of the body being sensory input that is from the body that then influences higher order processing, and then the emotions of the mind, which are more sophisticated things, how concepts can make us feel a particular way. Perhaps just as touching a hot stove may make us feel a particular way, certainly there's an idea or a thought of something that may provoke us to feel quite similarly. Maybe not peripherally similar, but in the minded sense quite similar. And we have both of the strong patterns that we have been exploring here. We have the light, the day, which are equivalents, and there's another equivalent, which is understanding, awareness. And then of the night, we have the darkness. We have unaware and unaware processing, a period for which we can't say that nothing exists, but it is certainly a process that occurs in relationship to, but somewhat separate from, that of the day. It is that work that is being done in the background, the computer that is on, but the interface is something completely different. But all the processes that are going on underneath the hood, so to speak, are fundamental to that interface. And so what can we say of all of this in a principled sense? On one hand, I think we can think of this structurally, that this is a pillar. It is not necessarily the entire identity of the heart, but this pillar is quite telling of our experience, and that we go through these periods of profound awareness and intense directed emotion that perhaps is intimately tied to our reason. And then we have emotional states that are within the darkness. Perhaps it's trying to stimulate a sense of awareness. Perhaps not. Perhaps it is the result of a process that is occurring similar as we would imagine in terms of creation, that at the end of the day there is a transition into darkness, followed by the morning, which is the transition place to the next day and into the light. We could also say that there is potential that this state has within it potential for confusion, since that it is shrouded in this darkness, that there is this aspect of unawareness to it, and it is by that unassured but also limited conscious experience, such a rumbling, like just before a volcanic eruption, we find ourselves in the night. And then as this buildup of potential occurs, as the dawn finds us, the heart and our reason are wed once again, and we are able to see, we are able to imagine, to enact purposes, to channel our productive endeavors. I think if we were to flip this on its head, a rather difficult thing to do, I think, but if we found it the case that our true attentive and driving sensibilities found ourselves in the night, what we would really be after would be to become more unaware, to be purely mindless processing agents to the whim of another or to the whim of some superficial experience, not really directed, not really interested in what was good. And I have to point out here that at the end of verse 18, leading up into 19, which is, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day, 18, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. And this division, as it is thrown into a subversion, into a reverse, God would not see this as good. It would be seen as bad. And so I can imagine as I think here, although my mind is grasping and teetering a little bit in terms of the exact parallel, I think it has enough of a taste of where we are going to understand that there is some sense here. And I have to also imagine that as we discussed the pillar of this heart, no matter how broad, no matter, maybe not broad, but no matter how specific it is beginning to become, we can see that the inverse of such a thing is no different than what we saw in days previous. It is just a further reflection on the absence of awareness, on the absence of attention, the desire of the mind towards nothing. Now there's a personal reflection that I think is appropriate here. On previous episodes I've spoken of intermittent periods that I go through for which I am disappointed at my own attentive capacity. Whether this be due to fatigue or to weakness, there are times that I find myself not as sturdy or resolute as I wish to be. And I'm grateful that I have the awareness to identify when this happens so I can correct for it, but nonetheless it happens. Sometimes it happens in small magnitudes and I catch it and I pick up on it, and sometimes it's quite large magnitudes. But as I'm thinking about this now, something interesting has occurred to me. And that conceptually, what I think is happening is that my heart is entering a place of darkness. And when I reflect on this place of darkness, I can't necessarily say that it is bad, for it is not necessarily an inversion unless I give in to it. For the darkness is a part of this process. It is governed by that lesser light. It is something that we can be aware of. But it is, I think, a natural state of our experience, that we cannot be these agents that are in tune with all of it all of the time. We cannot be. We are not gods. We are human beings. But I think at least the awareness should breed enough humility that would allow us to find the strength to resist falling into the pitfalls that the darkness affords the heart. And we can identify any number of these in our lives, whether it be eating something that we shouldn't, something sweet, like in my case, or abject, unproductive behaviors, like watching various YouTube videos that have really no productive value. We could think about this in terms of engaging with individuals, whether they be close relationships, friends, family, generally speaking, loved ones, or in a professional setting for which our mind is just not attending as it ought to the conversation at hand, and rather the mind and the heart is taking a passive approach to its obligations. Again, like I mentioned, forcing the day may not be possible, but as night comes, I think we should be aware of where we are, and we should understand that the mechanism of goodness is still taking place, even if we are not as motivated of agents as we are in the times of prosperity, where the heart is within the day, so to speak. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." So what I find interesting, again, is that we're getting more and more specific. The waters are drawing firmly together, that we see what's happening, what we are leading up to a particular type of consciousness. Of course, this is how we would see it. This is from our perspective, after all. But what's also interesting is that we are seeing this blend slowly of the formal and of the physical together. And in fact, the verse after this, we will get quite specific, mentioning specific animals, specific classes of animals. The thing about this verse that I think is beautiful, outside of identifying the broad pattern of a particular type of life, that of the moving creature, is that we are bringing forth the fowl, the image of the bird, but it's a bird with heavenly qualities. For it flies above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. Now we could think of this in a number of ways. We could think of this in a primitive way and have to wonder about how the ancients saw this especially the wise of the ancient populations. But in the primitive sense, in that when an individual would look up at the sky and see that expanse, and to associate that sky with heaven, giving it this physical representation in their mind. And they see the birds, these physical beings, that are flying up to this space that most of them must have understood, had in their mind a bit of a physical conception, but much like their own experience down on the ground, that experience with the earth was quite intimate, and they would also understand that their immediate experience did not necessarily involve much of the formal discussion, much of the ways in which the mind finds itself aloft, or maybe I should say the various types of information find itself aloft before such a mixture and consolidation of that information into both that material and of their own minds. And however incorrect it may seem to interpret the sky as the firmament of heaven, at least it offered this sort of artful landscape that they can imagine. Now, hopefully, in the more wise-minded, this firmament was something that did not fix itself to this place, and nor did the bird that, as it says, flies above the earth in the open firmament of heaven, that there is a richer significance to what we are seeing here. But I want to approach this like I have typically approached the Proverbs. A bit tedious, but thorough. Now I know that I've spoke of the first part of this verse, but again, in the spirit of the Proverbs, I want to break this down a little bit more. Now usually in the Proverbs, anytime God is mentioned, either he's doing something or there's a reference to the Lord, it's a chance for us to formulate a picture, to understand the way of God, how it's possible to conceptualize how the first cause moves through our experience, or how we feel the effects of that. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life." As we've been discussing, the waters I've conceptualized as information. And I think that within that marker, that symbol, we can find a fruitful place for which we can build productive thought. And so I want to talk about the etymology of the word information. Now, beginning with its Latin origins, we have the Latin verb informare, meaning to shape, form, or educate. The verb is composed of the prefix in, meaning into, and formare, which means to form or to shape. And this, of course, can refer to shaping or forming something within the mind or physically. In medieval Latin usage, the word began to take on a more abstract meaning related to formation of the mind or knowledge, describing the concept of shaping somebody's mind or imparting knowledge, educating, understanding. In Middle English, around the 14th century, information was borrowed from the old French term information and came to mean knowledge communicated. By the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, the word information evolved to denote facts, data, or again knowledge, passed between two sources. But this data, of course, is just a representation. It is an observation, I suppose we can say. That if I'm going to say a data point, it is not really to say that of the original Latin that what we are doing is shaping or forming something or educating, but rather just observing. It's more of a passive expansion of that term. But I would like to focus on the root, on this Latin root, with regard to information. When we think about the waters, it is quite easy to imagine something being shaped or formed because of this substance. And of this substance, it's almost difficult to attribute words to it. Because on one hand, it's material, on the other hand, it's immaterial. But altogether, we say that it is information. We can also say, at a fundamental, that it occupies the space of thingness, that it's something that can be identified, even if it may not be identifiable immediately to the human being. There are things that I have going on in my mind that would be very difficult for another person to identify and measure. There may be certain ways of understanding the electrical activity in my brain to know generally what is happening, but they will not know my thoughts. They will not experience my feelings. And this concept of selfhood and identity and of experience, there's such a large gap, it would seem to me, between that which is and the level at which we interface with this reality. And so I see this information that is now being coalesced and gathered, not in the sense that a child may articulate Play-Doh and form it into an elephant or a giraffe or whatever, but rather the information is forming as it did, and as we can do our best to understand how it came to be. And within our scientific toolkit, we have understood that things have progressed over a long period of time to come to be as we understand them to be. And I also think that this concept of a fundamental material, the word is incorrect, a fundamental substance, again, it's material, a fundamental existence, a fundamental identity, that can be split, as we have seen between two different types of waters. I find this base level information quite fascinating. I find it interesting that although the waters were separated by the firmament, they yet come back together, as if they needed separating in order for the mind to understand the difference. Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life. That term, life, it would seem that it is a characteristic of the waters above, but certainly occupies the domain of the waters below. It is of both physical and of purposeful action. And with this in mind, the second half of the verse immediately goes into a further narrowing. It is a reiteration that although we have already mentioned the moving creature that has life, now we mention a specific moving creature that has life, a fowl, a bird, that may fly above the earth, lowercase e, in the open firmament of heaven. So there is a rich symbolic structure that I think we have, that we are exposed to here. And keeping in mind what I said before about the fundamental information about the waters, and about that of life, and life's relationship to the waters. The fowl is an expression of the coming together of information. It is an expression that seems to return to the very place that had played such a pivotal role in the formation of that thing, of that bird. So there's a way I think that we can find ourselves interpreting this verse. If we are to go that lowercase e route that I mentioned before, where the capital E, earth, is more strictly the material, and the lowercase e includes both the material aspect but also the concept of earth. In the beginning God created heaven and the earth was without form and void. The darkness was upon the face of the deep. And so in some sense, what we are referring to here is a creature that has been formed, a purposeful creature that has been formed by these waters, that is now flying above the concept of earth. And surely we must ask the question, how can that be? How does this being that... And before the mind is quick to resent this abstraction, I would like to point out that regardless of whether or not I'm onto something with the lowercase e earth and the capital E earth, we can still follow the general reasoning of the condition of earth before its material form, which is form in general, and after it. But also keeping in mind that as we move through the second half of this verse, the fowl that may fly above the earth is in the open firmament of heaven. But to return now to the earth, flying above the earth. This concept of above, I think, is interesting. At the base level, at the level that probably means the least, we think of the physical conception of the bird that flies high above the surface of the earth. But if we think about it in a broader sense, a fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament, again, we should remember what the firmament is for. The firmament serves as something to separate, but also something to give understanding to. So indeed, it would seem that this being, any purposeful agent, regardless of its condition, seems to fly above the concept of earth and finds itself within the firmament, itself a division of two things, of material, or maybe I should say it is of two things, of material and of that waters above purposeful, meaningful information, directed information. But it is not the fact that the bird has this capacity to divide and to separate, but rather it seems that the bird is a part of a process that has allowed things to be, or to become, individual identities. And if we are to take this term, identity, and break it down, follow the etymological chain, in Latin we have identitas, which stems from the word idem, or idem, meaning the same. The idea of oneness also is implicit in this term. That there is something about a thing, or a principal identity, that has qualities that are consistent over time. There's an aspect of permanence or continuity to something's essential characteristics. From medieval Latin, we have the expansion of the term, which included this sense of personal sameness or continuous self. In this way, we have both the human identity, but also the spiritual, the divine aspect, divine identity. As I think about myself or many other people, a person is quite complex, and their identity is something that is an aggregate of a multitude of things. Certain things take up more space and occupy a more fundamental role, I would say, as a part of that identity. Certainly there are barriers to the identity because it is still one thing. From Middle French, we have an expanded meaning to encompass the notion of a person's distinctiveness or individuality. Qualities that make one person unique from another person. In English usage, by the 16th century, it maintained this dual sense of sameness and uniqueness, and evolved into the 18th century, signifying a combination of personal characteristics, experiences, affiliations, all of which form an individual's concept or social role. And I have to imagine that even among the original term, given the root that we were thinking about oneness or sameness, going through this chain and attributing to a particular era the idea that given the Latin root, that some of the later interpretations or the evolution of the word would not have applied more towards the source, or again towards that seed or the root of that word, I think is a bit preposterous. It is likely the case that among discussions about oneness or sameness, the individual was close at that point of understanding and of creating that word. But nevertheless, the word is fundamental, I think, to understand what is being implied here in the case of the bird. Fowl that may fly above the earth and in the open firmament of heaven. So we have an image of information that is being consolidated to form various identities. Some identities have a different fundamental structure, that they can still be considered identities, but life as opposed to raw material is quite different in fundamental ways. There is a purposeful component even in the most basic of cells, whereas a rock, for example, and the underlying material structure does not participate in the same way, or to the same degree, maybe I should say. And so as we think about this graduated arena of organizing information, we find ourselves now thinking about a bird, a quite sophisticated level of organization. And once this level of organization reaches a certain point, we are then prompted or asked to consider what it would mean for the bird to, and that maybe by extension we could say the consolidation of information in such a way moves into a particular space, almost like it's moving back to something, a type of remembrance, perhaps. Focusing on this phrase, above the earth, in the open firmament of heaven, is important. Because certainly, regardless of the physical properties, or the physical qualities that we might associate with a bird, like the ability to fly, which may not be a physical property in the strict sense, it's a functional property, surely. Physically, it possesses the structure necessary to fly. But the fact that it flies above base material is an important step in our understanding of the bird's place. And the bird, again, is a principal identity that is representative of something much greater. What is greater, I would say, is the structure of this experience, of this reality, I suppose we could say. But more specifically, the firmament is often seen in situations where it is dividing something from something else. It is the very thing that separates but also identifies. Now, God's role in this is fundamental, of course. The fundament is not necessarily God, but it is the tool of God, maybe we could say. It is heaven, it is the heaven. We could think about it in terms of an identity, just like we can think about the bird, that it has certain qualities that make it up. Of its qualities, we can say that it is a fundamental divider. Perhaps it forms the boundaries between different fundamental concepts, different fundamental things. It is that ancient wall that surrounds the ancient city often identified by what's within the walls, the culture that is established because of that. Within the mind of man, we have our own identities that is separated by physical barriers. Physical barriers are not the only thing that serve as that principal boundary. But given our experience, it is one of the things that appears to be quite obvious, that if we are to separate principal identities, physical separation is an important and fundamental one. But we also have to remember that within the firmament is the very thing that it played a role in separating. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters." So it separates information. Now, it doesn't mean that it was the thing that caused information to be. Information exists prior to. But it is, again, the tool that is used to separate and therefore make easy or make possible the identification of things. After this point, after the waters were separated, they were able to be gathered into their respective arenas or domains to form the material aspect and to form life and that purposeful aspect. Also within the identity of the firmament are these lights. Lights that give awareness, that give understanding, that give intelligibility, that give thingness recognizability, or again, intelligibility. And so if this bird is to be flying in the open firmament, it is in some sense participating not only in the graduated structure of the organization of information, but also in a sense it is returning and being identified because it's flying within this thing, the principal identity of which is to identify by the lights that are bestowed to it, but also by its quality of separating things. And by virtue of this participation on the part of the bird, it retains its identity. It retains its principal identity. Now there's another interesting pattern that we can draw here. Just like with Earth in that capital E, lowercase e situation. In terms of heaven, we see a similar pattern, that when God calls, or makes the equivalence, the firmament heaven, and God said, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day, what we see here in this verse, and subsequent and previous verses, that when heaven is referred to, it's not in the capital H, it's the lowercase h. And it's referred to as the firmament of heaven. Like there is this heaven that is a broader piece, like the hand of the person that is speaking, for example. My hand is a part of me. It's not necessarily my principal identity, but it makes up a part of my physical structure. My physical structure is a part of my broader principled identity. In this way, it seems that the firmament is, in some way, a small piece or a piece of the identity of the much broader heaven. And bizarrely, there is this relationship that God has called the firmament capital H heaven. Now, what exactly this means, I don't really know. It's possible that it could be, as we've been discussing before, the next step in that fractal relationship. That heaven exists, and then God creates this firmament, and then the firmament does its work dividing and orienting. And as it does so, in the process it creates the identity of heaven, even though it already was created in the substrate of heaven. It's hard to say exactly. Perhaps this will become more clear later on. But we see the term, the firmament of heaven, in verse 14. We see it again in 17. We see it again in 20, which we are currently on. So we'll keep this image in the back of our minds, that the firmament as a tool, or as a piece of some broader identity, which ultimately is the identity of God, because it must be traced back to this first cause. And I was thinking for a moment an analogy, and sometimes my mind wrestles with certain things, certain unfortunate situations that can befall a person, whether it be a disease or war, for example, and life can be just sort of snapped out of existence without any seeming care or love. And I think about my own body. I think about the various cells that are within me, all of which I don't really understand on a experiential level. I can experience various sensory inputs, and perhaps I can understand when danger occurs and when death occurs. But the experience of death is not something that my principal identity, or at least that which I consider to be my principal identity, the thing that is talking into the microphone, it doesn't seem to go through. Which I'm thankful for. I wouldn't want my mind to go through some existential crisis every time a cell senesced. But that being said, I think it's an interesting reflection on the broader scale of things. That at the unifying aspect of it, generally speaking, the agent is desirous for its own safety, for its own prosperity, but also it cares for itself, and it cares for the elements of itself for which it doesn't have an intimate relationship like it does within its mind. But nonetheless it must care, perhaps in part by obligation, but also, hopefully, by love of the whole of it, that even the individual agents that participate in that broader experience, that broader identity, are taken along on that productive pursuit, on that pursuit of goodness, or the pursuit of life. And God created whales and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. So, I think that there are ways of understanding the symbolism behind what is said here, because I don't think that what is being referred to when it is said of whales, that it is referring to a particular group of species, a particular classification set. I think the classification is an aspect of this, that there is a reference to kindness, that there is this reference again to identity, as I've talked about with the bird. But there seems to be even more of a rich symbolic significance when the whale is mentioned in particular. That perhaps in the way that the bird flies above the earth, that aboveness is meant to signify at once the organization of information and of matter, and its participation with that fundamental tool or property, the firmament of heaven, that has led to the establishment of identity itself. When we are asked to consider the whale, I think of the opposite situation. I think of a creature that dives to great depths, that unlike the bird, finds itself beneath the solid land, if you will. And it's not to say that because the creature finds itself beneath solid land, that it is in some sense, an insignificant form or consolidation of information relative to that of dry land or inanimate matter. On the contrary, I think there are two potential roads that we can think about here. But first, there's a pattern that has emerged here that I think is important. It's fundamental, I think, in order to progress to the next step in thought. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly." And so there's a pattern here, and it seems rather strange to me that in the first instance, it says, God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life." And then in the second verse 21, it says, "And God created great whales, and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly." Why would this be repeated twice? Now there's one possibility to be thought of here, that in the second verse, what we see is the word every, where in the first verse we did not see every. So perhaps we could say that in the first instance this was a process or procedure that did not include the totality of all living things, but in the second instance it did. Yet there's another way that we can think about it, in the sense that the waters were consolidated to make living creatures abundantly, and that the term every maybe doesn't have a great significance. And this is a bit jumping ahead here, but after this day, after the fifth day, the first part of the day on the sixth, in verse 24, we have, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so." There's a few things there that we can get into that are a little bit too premature. But it is a reiteration, and it is a type of reiteration that I think points to something different. And it seems that we are not necessarily talking about all living creatures full stop. For if it was truly the case that every living creature that moves resulted from the aggregation of the waters at the end of day 4, or at the end of day 5 rather, then we wouldn't really have these subsequent verses. It wouldn't really make any sense. And so while I think that there is an aspect that is implying that many forms of life are beginning to emerge, I think that there's a point that is broader, perhaps not as explicitly stated, but I think the hidden point here is wound up within the symbol of the whale somehow, within the great whale. So let's begin here to break this down, and then try to tackle this problem of every living creature that moves. Because, in my mind, there is no way that this is purely a physical representation. It's a much broader abstraction. So as it stands, I'm thinking about the whale as this creature physically finds itself within his environment. The whale in and of itself, the sea creature, the large sea creature, the great sea creature, is a symbol. It's a symbol for life, because the whale is a creature that has that enacts its own purposes, but there are many forms of life that do this, but it specifically mentions a whale. The verse can mention any sort of animal or of life. We could think of something even more fundamental in terms of specific cells, for example. And yet it doesn't do this. We're specifically asked to consider the whale. And so there's more than just life that is being considered here. We're being asked to reflect on the identity of the whale and what principal aspects of that whale we can transpose onto this abstraction or illustration of ours. So what else about this whale, other than its greatness and size, its capacity for life? Well, it dwells deep. It finds itself in a space, regardless of what that space is, which we'll get to in a moment. It finds itself in a vast space of potential. And this creature can do whatever it pleases in that vast and open space. But it is a particular type of space. The whale lives within the sea, within the ocean. The ocean, again, a much broader symbol, characterizing potentially chaos, uncertainty, that which is untamed. I think the fluidity of it by its nature lends itself to this identification. The waters are unconsolidated in the sense of the sea. So we have this formation of this creature, the consolidation of information, in an environment that is still highly unconsolidated. It's continuing to unify and to progress towards something. What is it progressing towards? We don't seem to know. The reiteration here, and every living creature that moves, I think is to imply that where we are, perhaps in a temporal sense, but not restricted to a temporal sense, but developmentally, we find ourselves in this open sea. We see the whale, we see all these living creatures that have become. That again, this information is consolidated and now they exist. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything that will exist exists, because I think we all understand that just because this process has occurred, the process of Genesis, that it occurred at the outset and fundamentally, it doesn't mean that there are not sort of fundamental, ingrained cycles or patterns that repeat themselves within others. That is to say, that new creatures, new species come to be after some time development. The process of development here really is not the concern, I think, of the description. It is rather the landscape that I think is what is most important and valuable. And so for the whale, this great thing to be created in such a chaotic environment, a chaotic and untamed environment, is an interesting thing to reflect on. Because what it seems like is that we are given a snapshot. We could say that it's in time, we could say that it's in development. But given the snapshot, of course everything is going to be there. All the living creatures, given that point of consolidation, will be there. But given different and farther snapshots, there will be different creatures that emerge, as we have just discussed in chapter 24. Verse 24. So I mentioned that there are two ways that we can go about this. I'm not sure I quite remember that second way, but I think there is more to be said about the relationship of the whale to the earth. And that there is a sense of belowness. It's below the landed earth, we would say. But the landed earth, although technically maybe not correct if we were just to say or draw the equivalency between earth and matter, or again, inanimate matter. If we are to say landed earth, just as we are to consider landed earth when we think of the bird that flies above it in the open firmament of heaven, we could see that the whale swims beneath the earth, and yet is not indicated that it swims within the open firmament, which is quite interesting. Perhaps it does, but it doesn't say so. But the whale is still a principled identity, just as the bird is. But the difference is its position. And is to say that that which dwells in unconsolidation finds itself, I think, in a precarious place because of the instability. And that while physically the whale in its environment is perfectly fit for that environment, if we are thinking about this symbolically, that there is a grand consolidation of information that exists within an environment that is unconsolidated, then it would seem that that unconsolidated information would be quite violent. I would imagine like the extreme temperature at the beginning of the universe, that the very identity would be threatened because of the lack of the firmament, because of the lack of the separating principle and the greater and the lesser light, even though the lights are there and they govern. So the identity will hold. But I wonder about this image that is being brought forth, about the instability of an identity in an unconsolidated information environment. But the thing about this information in the unconsolidated environment is that it is not alone, that there are other pieces of information there that are competing with it, perhaps they are working with it, assisting it. the waters brought forth abundantly these creatures. After their kind. And so there again, we find ourselves thinking that these packets of information, consolidated information, in an otherwise chaotic environment, untamed environment, unconsolidated environment, although there are different types, they are able to reproduce, consolidate more information to its kind, create more stability for its own identity. Although one individual thing may be finite and temporary, its existence affords the ability to propagate, to move into the future, to expand the species identity, if we will. And every winged fowl after his kind. A throwback to that last verse, for which we are seeing an animal or information that is very close to the very thing that is doing the separating and identifying. Just because it is close to that doesn't mean it's eclipsed by the light. It's protected by it, it's governed by it. The same thing happens there as it does deep beneath the sea in unconsolidated environments and waters. And God saw that it was good. The process continues. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." So I think I'm going to end this episode here, sort of at a cliffhanger moment. But we'll continue next time with chapter 1 of Genesis. And keeping in mind, we are still in chapter 26 of the Proverbs. So what's likely going to happen is we'll finish the 5th day and then go back to chapter 26. Make sure we reintegrate into the heart that principle, the next pillar of the heart, and then move forward.